What the Yakuza enforcers didn't realize, when they surrounded the blind street musician in Tokyo's crowded marketplace, was that the unassuming old man with his shakuhachi flute had once been Japan's most decorated counterintelligence operative. The sound of a briefcase clicking open behind them confirmed their fatal error, as Takeo Nakamura's assistant emerged from the shadows. A former Tier 1 operative, with 27 confirmed kills in 7 countries, now stood between them and their target, his hand resting on a weapon they wouldn't live long enough to identify. The haunting notes of Batch's shakan filled the busy Tokyo intersection, somehow rising above the cacophony of urban noise. Takeo Nakamura's fingers moved across his violin with practiced precision, drawing sounds so pure they stopped hurried pedestrians in their tracks. At 32, his face carried both youth and timeless wisdom, his unseeing eyes hidden behind dark glasses. While his body swayed with each powerful movement of the bow, the violin case at his feet collected yen coins and small bills, though the quality of his playing belonged in concert halls, not street corners. Takeo's ear tracked the distinctive sound of each donation, the soft flutter of paper currency, the varied tones of different coins striking others. His heightened hearing mapped the crowd forming around him, cataloging movement patterns, conversations, the subtle shifts of attention. 20 meters away, nearly invisible in the shadow of a vending machine, Kenji Tanaka maintained his daily vigil. His stillness contrasted with Takeo's flowing movements, his dark eyes constantly scanning for threats, while appearing to casually check his phone. The former Spec Ops operator's presence went unnoticed by the growing audience, exactly as intended. "Beautiful," an elderly woman whispered as Takeo completed the piece, the final note hanging in the air like a prayer. She dropped a coin that Takeo recognized by sound as 500 yen. His smile of thanks turned precisely to her location, despite his blindness. "Thank you," he replied softly, his voice gentle and melodious. "Would you like to hear Paganini next?" As Takeo began the technically demanding Caprice No. 24, 3 men in expensive suits paused at the edge of the crowd. Their studied casualness couldn't hide the coiled tension in their movements, the way they surveyed the area with predatory assessment. Yakuza, mid-level soldiers establishing territory. Takeo's acute hearing picked up their whispered conversation, despite the distance and his own playing. His expression remained serene, but the subtle shift in his posture was all the signal Kenji needed. Without appearing to move, the bodyguard adjusted his position, creating clear lines of sight to the new arrivals, while maintaining his invisibility. To casual observation, the smallest disruptions in airflow, the faintest changes in crowd density, these were Takeo's windows into a visual world. He had lost his sight at 12, but the decades since had transformed his other senses into extraordinary tools. He continued playing flawlessly while mapping every movement around him, including the deliberate way the Yakuza members were noting. Businesses evaluating street performers, marking territory. As the music reached its crescendo, one of the suited men approached Takeo's spot, dropping a 1,000 yen note into the violin case with deliberate heaviness. A message, not a donation. The man's cologne carried notes of sandalwood and something metallic, gun oil perhaps. Takeo acknowledged with a slight nod, never missing a note. "Beautiful playing," the man said in Japanese, his voice carrying an undertone of assessment. "This is a good spot, profitable. It would be a shame if something happened to disturb such talent." The threat was perfectly wrapped in courtesy, but Takeo heard it clearly, as did Kenji, whose hand casually moved to his jacket pocket, muscle memory from years of combat readiness activating. While his face remained impassive, the first battle lines had been drawn, invisible to the appreciative crowd still captivated by Takeo's playing. The Yakuza saw only a vulnerable blind musician, an easy target in their expansion plans. They hadn't yet noticed the shadow that protected him, or understood that Takeo's blindness had given him senses that made him far from helpless. The music continued, beautiful and uninterrupted, giving no indication of the storm gathering around. The street corner that Takeo Nakamura had claimed as his own. While Takeo Nakamura's violin captivated passers-by, Kenji Tanaka maintained his position 3 meters behind the musician, his back against a concrete pillar that offered optimal sightlines down both sides of the busy street. To casual observers, he appeared to be just another appreciative audience member, occasionally dropping yen into Takeo's open case. Nothing in his relaxed posture betrayed his constant tactical awareness or the sour P226 concealed beneath his weathered leather jacket. Kenji's eyes continuously scanned the crowd, identifying potential threats with the practiced efficiency that had once made him the Japan Self-Defense Force's top close protection specialist. His gaze lingered briefly on 2 men in expensive suits observing from across the street, Yakuza foot soldiers mapping territory. Their position offered poor tactical advantage, suggesting reconnaissance rather than immediate threat. 5 years ago, Kenji had found Takeo performing outside Shinjuku Station, surrounded by a group of drunk businessmen growing increasingly aggressive. The blind musician had maintained remarkable dignity despite the escalating danger. Kenji's intervention that night had been swift, efficient, and professionally invisible, exactly as his JSDF training had taught him. Only Takeo, with his extraordinarily heightened senses, had recognized something different about the man who dispersed the troublemakers. "You move like water," Takeo had said afterward, facing Kenji with uncanny accuracy despite his blindness. Military? That simple question had sparked an unlikely partnership. Takeo refused the safety of indoor venues, insisting his music belonged to the streets. Kenji recognized the tactical vulnerabilities, but respected the musician's choice. Instead of changing Takeo's path, he'd simply ensured it remained protected. Now, as Takeo's bow danced across violin strings in a flawless rendition of Paganini's Caprice, No. 24, Kenji maintained his vigilance. The Yakuza observers across the street represented a potential escalation in territory disputes. Their interest in street performers' prime locations had grown as tourism increased. Kenji shifted slightly, adjusting his position to maintain optimal response capability while remaining invisible to casual observation. His protection methods had evolved specifically for Takeo. Silent signals through footsteps Takeo could feel through the pavement. Tactical positioning that utilized the blind musician's extraordinary acoustic awareness that the Yakuza observers eventually departed. But Kenji's vigilance never wavered. In his experience, the most dangerous threats were the ones you didn't see coming. The morning crowd in Shibuya's arts district had thinned as Takeo Nakamura's bow danced across violin strings, coaxing Paganini's Caprice No. 24 into the crisp autumn air. His unseeing eyes remained closed, face tilted slightly upward as if watching clouds he could only imagine. To passers-by, he seemed lost in his music, unaware of the world around him. They were wrong. 3 men, west entrance. Designer suits, Yakuza tattoos visible at collar line. Kenji murmured from his position near a coffee stand, voice barely audible but perfectly positioned for Takeo's enhanced hearing. The blind violinist never missed a note, his music uninterrupted. As he processed the information, "Same ones as yesterday?" Takeo asked, his question woven seamlessly between musical phrases, lips barely moving. +1. Higher rank based on deference patterns. They're expanding territory methodically. Kenji sipped his coffee, appearing to any observer as just another businessman enjoying street music during his break. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes tracked the Yakuza members with military precision, noting their movement patterns, positioning, concealed weapons. Across the street, Old Man Yoshida hurriedly lowered his noodle shop security gate. 3. Other businesses had done the same within minutes of the Yakuza's arrival. Last week, the vintage record store 2 blocks over had suffered a mysterious electrical fire after refusing protection fees. The vintage clothing boutique beside it had closed permanently the following day. Takeo's fingers found notes with flawless precision while his other senses mapped the shifting crowd. People were moving away from the Yakuza's path, creating subtle currents in the ambient sound. Street performers in other spots were packing up equipment, disappearing before trouble found them. "They're watching you specifically now," Kenji noted, moving casually to deposit his coffee cup in a trash bin, repositioning himself with clear lines of sight to all 4 Yakuza members, testing to see if you're aware of them. Takeo transitioned smoothly into Tchaikovsky, his music filling the growing emptiness as people evacuated the area. His performance case remained open on the ground before him, scattered with coins and bills from the morning crowd, a calculated vulnerability. "Mr. Nakamura," the lead Yakuza called out, voice carrying artificial courtesy. "Your music is beautiful, a true cultural treasure." Takeo continued playing, offering a polite nod in the voice's direction. His fingers never faltered despite the tension now crackling through the air. "However, this is now a special business improvement district," the Yakuza continued, moving closer. "Street performers require proper permits for protection." Kenji shifted his weight imperceptibly, calculating precise movement paths should intervention become necessary. His fingers brushed the concealed karambit knife at his belt, a last resort he hoped wouldn't be needed. Not yet, not until they understood exactly what they were facing. The morning sun cast long shadows across Shinjuku's pedestrian thoroughfare. As Takeo Nakamura's violin filled the air with Paganini's Caprice No. 24, his fingers danced across strings with flawless precision, each note perfect despite the blindness that had taken his sight during childhood. The crowds that gathered dropped yen into his open case, mesmerized by the contradiction, a blind man creating such visual beauty through sound. From his position 6 meters away, Kenji Tanaka maintained his usual vigil, appearing to casual observers as nothing more than a street vendor selling tourist trinkets. His seemingly relaxed posture masked combat-ready awareness, eyes constantly scanning for threats while cataloging every pedestrian within 30 meters of Takeo's performance space. The 3 Yakuza members had been watching for 20 minutes. Their expensive suits and calculated movements marked them as Suichi clan soldiers, not the usual street-level enforcers. Kenji had noted their arrival immediately, tracking their positions while maintaining his cover. When they began moving toward Takeo during a brief pause between compositions, Kenji adjusted his stance imperceptibly, weight shifting to the balls of his feet. "Beautiful music," the lead Yakuza said, his politeness laced with subtle menace. "You play with such skill, Nakamura-san." Takeo's head tilted slightly, his heightened hearing instantly recognizing the danger in the man's tone. "Thank you," he replied, fingers resting lightly on his violin. "I'm pleased you enjoy it. This area has become very profitable for street performers," the Yakuza continued. "The Suichi clan provides protection for businesses here. Perhaps you should consider our services." Takeo's face remained serene, betraying no fear despite the threat. "I require no protection. I am simply a musician." The Yakuza's smile vanished. "Everyone needs protection, blind man. 2,000 yen daily would be reasonable, considering your disability." When the man reached toward Takeo's violin case, he found his wrist suddenly locked in a grip of steel. Kenji had crossed the distance with silent efficiency, his movement economical and precise. Nothing in his expression suggested effort as he applied specifically calculated pressure to nerve clusters. "The musician is not interested," Kenji stated quietly, voice modulated to carry only to the 3 Yakuza. "I suggest finding business elsewhere." The Yakuza enforcers reacted with practiced coordination, the two flanking members moving to surround Kenji while the leader attempted to break the wrist lock. Their training was evident in their positioning, but so were tactical flaws that Kenji noted instantly. What followed appeared almost choreographed to bystanders, three men attacking, then suddenly finding themselves immobilized or redirected with minimal apparent effort. Kenji's movements contained no wasted energy, each response calibrated to neutralize rather than damage. Within 17 seconds, all three Yakuza stood frozen in painful compliance holds. "The musician plays here," Kenji stated, his voice remaining conversational despite the tension. "He will continue to play here. That arrangement is non-negotiable." He released them with mathematical precision, stepping back to a position that appeared casual but provided optimal response positioning. The Yakuza straightened their expensive suits, faces struggling to mask humiliation with controlled rage. "You've made a serious error," the leader hissed, dignity wounded more than his wrist. "Do you have any idea who we represent?" "Three mid-level soldiers of the Shuichi clan, Eastern Division," Kenji replied calmly. "Operating without direct authorization. From Hideki Shuichi, who would not approve of harassing a blind musician. Your names and family registrations are less relevant." The precision of this intelligence visibly rattled the Yakuza. They retreated with manufactured dignity, disappearing into the crowd with backward glances that promised future conflict. Takeo, who had remained perfectly still throughout the confrontation, lifted his violin once more. "Batch's shakan would be appropriate, I think," he said quietly, as though nothing had occurred. His fingers found the strings, and music filled the space where violence had been moments before. Kenji returned to his position, resuming his surveillance. The confrontation had revealed more than he'd intended about his capabilities, but avoiding that had become impossible. The Yakuza would return stronger, more prepared. Parameters had changed. Tactical adjustments would be necessary. As Takeo's music transformed the morning air, pedestrians resumed their routines, unaware of the danger that had briefly surfaced. But Kenji recognized the opening moves of a larger game. The Shuichi clan would not tolerate defiance. This was only the first exchange. Evening fell, and Takeo Nakamura's violin sang through Shibuya's bustling streets. His fingers danced across the strings with uncanny precision, melodies arresting hurried commuters mid-step. He swayed slightly, sightless eyes closed in concentration. What no one noticed was how his head tilted subtly at precise intervals, tracking sounds beyond his music. 20 meters away, Kenji Tanaka leaned against a vending machine, relaxed in appearance, alert in reality. He had chosen this position for its sightlines, giving him control over the primary choke points. The Yakuza attack 3 days ago had changed everything. Now he varied his placement, using coded signals Takeo could detect beneath the music. "They're back," Takeo murmured between songs. He had heard them before they entered the square, the distinct cadence of their footsteps unmistakable. His fingers never faltered as he transitioned into Vivaldi, but a subtle tap of his foot conveyed their position. Kenji had expected this. The Yakuza never backed down for long. His hand brushed against the tactical knife beneath his jacket, an old habit from his military days. 3 men, east entrance, moving with the swagger of predators certain their previous warning had been enough. Takeo's violin never hesitated, though his senses catalogued every shift around him. The audience remained blissfully unaware, entranced by music that soared above the urban chaos. Few realized the blind musician had mapped every inch of his surroundings, could recognize individuals by their footsteps alone, could sense shifts in air pressure signaling an approaching threat. "Your music sounds different today, Nakamura-san," observed Mrs. Tanaka, an elderly shop owner and one of their informants. "More intense." What she didn't say was that the Yakuza's second-in-command had been asking questions that morning. Kenji caught the message. He adjusted his position, optimizing defensive coverage. The Takahashi tea house owner swept his storefront, a near imperceptible nod confirming he, too, had noticed the changes. The network of local business owners tired of Yakuza intimidation was growing. As twilight deepened, Takeo's violin transitioned to Paganini. The impossibly complex passages provided the perfect cover for the silent communication system Kenji had refined over years of partnership. Every flourish, every rhythmic variation, carried information about threats and defenses. The Yakuza believed they were intimidating a helpless blind musician. They had no idea they were challenging one of Tokyo's most efficient security teams, an alliance between extraordinary sensory perception and lethal combat experience. Tonight, they would learn the cost of that mistake. Shibuya's streets pulsed with neon and humanity as Kenji completed his third perimeter sweep. To most, he was just another man checking his phone. None would guess his casual stance concealed precise calculations, choke points, angles of approach, retreat routes. He had transformed Takeo's performance space into a fortified zone. Northeast. Corner has poor visibility, Kenji muttered, knowing Takeo's ears would catch his words over the violin's notes. 2 blind spots near the convenience store. Takeo's fingers never faltered as he nodded slightly. His sightless eyes might not see the city, but he had mapped it through sound. He sensed the way air shifted when someone approached from behind. He recognized the echoes from the alleyway. Even scent patterns told a story. "They'll come from the south," Takeo said between musical phrases. 3 men watched yesterday. Combat boots trying to sound casual. Kenji adjusted, impressed as always. Takeo could distinguish whispered conversations at 30 meters. Over 2 years, their partnership had become almost instinctual. Kenji's battlefield expertise, complemented by Takeo's unparalleled awareness. "Old couple at your 4 o'clock, Takeo murmured, transitioning seamlessly to Vivaldi. "There. Regulars, the woman just put something in your jacket pocket." Kenji felt the folded paper Mrs. Yamamoto had slipped him. Another intelligence update. The elderly shopkeeper and her husband had been watching Yakuza movements for days, part of the informal network that had formed around Takeo's performance. Spot. The gang's increasing pressure on local businesses had unified the community in unexpected ways. The note confirmed Kenji's suspicions. Yakuza enforcers planned to make an example of the blind musician who defied their protection demands. Tonight or tomorrow, according to Mrs. Yamamoto's sources. Kenji's eyes narrowed as he calculated force estimates, likely weapons, tactical approaches. The surrounding buildings, street furniture, and crowd patterns all became elements in his defensive calculations. "They're bringing more men this time," Kenji said quietly, maintaining his casual posture while scanning rooftops. "At least 8, possibly armed." Takeo's violin never faltered, though a slight tension in his shoulders told Kenji he understood the escalation. "The reverberations change when someone carries a weapon," he responded. "Different weight distribution, different movement patterns." Kenji had witnessed this phenomenon repeatedly. Takeo could often identify armed individuals by sound alone, a skill that had saved their lives twice before. It was one of many reasons Kenji had remained by his side long after their initial chance encounter. As evening deepened, Kenji finalized his preparations. Strategic objects repositioned to provide cover. Escape routes confirmed and cleared. Potential weapons identified within the urban environment. The crowd flowing around Takeo's performance created both tactical challenges and advantages that Kenji had learned to leverage. "Water bottle by your left foot," Kenji murmured. "Emergency phone in right pocket. If I say movement 3, head directly to the metro entrance." Takeo acknowledged with the slightest nod, his violin speaking of. beauty while his mind calculated survival. They had weathered smaller confrontations before, but both men sensed the coming storm would be different. The Yakuza weren't accustomed to resistance. They wouldn't underestimate the blind musician and his companion a second time. The evening crowd had gathered in unusual numbers around Takeo Nakamura's performance spot in Shibuya's pedestrian district. His violin sang with haunting precision, each note of Bach's chakan filling the urban canyon with emotions that transcended language. Few noticed how the blind musician's head tilted slightly at the approaching footsteps his heightened hearing could distinguish from the ambient crowd noise with remarkable precision. Kenji Tanaka appeared to be just another admirer standing at the edge of the gathering. His posture relaxed, his attention seemingly focused on the music. Only the most trained observer would notice how his stance allowed immediate movement in any direction, how his eyes continuously scanned the perimeter, how his hand never strayed far from the concealed kabar knife beneath his jacket. The Yakuza approached from 3 directions simultaneously, their coordinated movement betraying professional planning. 8 men total, moving with practiced nonchalance through the crowd. Their leader, Hideki Matsuo, carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to instilling fear. The dragon tattoo visible at his collar marked him as Sumiyoshi Kai, the second largest Yakuza family in Tokyo. Takeo's violin never faltered, but his head tilted again, their prearranged signal. He had detected the change in crowd dynamics, the subtle shift in acoustic patterns that indicated approaching threat. 3 years of partnership had refined their communication to near perfection. Kenji's response was immediate but measured. A subtle shift in position, moving closer to Takeo while maintaining tactical advantage. His eyes identified primary threats, calculated engagement sequences, established priority targets. The weight of his Glock 19 pressed reassuringly against his side, though he hoped close-quarters techniques would suffice. "Beautiful music," Matsuo said in Japanese, stepping forward as the piece ended, ashamed to interrupt. His men formed a loose semicircle, cutting off escape routes while attempting to appear casual to onlookers. Takeo's sightless eyes seemed to look through Matsuo as he lowered his violin. "The next piece begins when ready." His coded response alerted Kenji that he had mapped all 8 positions through sound alone. "Your protection money is overdue," Matsuo continued, voice hardening. "This territory belongs to Sumiyoshi Kai now." The crowd sensed tension, beginning to back away. A young woman fumbled for her phone, likely calling police, though Kenji knew response times in this district averaged 7 minutes. "Too long." "I believe you are mistaken," Takeo replied calmly, placing his violin carefully in its case. The movement appeared submissive but actually cleared his performance space of obstacles. "This is a public area." Matsuo's hand moved toward his jacket. That single gesture triggered Kenji's response. The first Yakuza went down before he realized Kenji had moved. A precision strike to the brachial plexus, temporarily paralyzing his right arm. The second managed a startled exclamation before a sweep took his legs, his head striking concrete with calculated force, sufficient to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. Takeo dropped to one knee at the first sound of conflict, making himself a smaller target while simultaneously retrieving the telescoping steel baton concealed in his violin case. His blindness had never been the handicap people assumed. 3 years of Kenji's training had transformed his heightened senses into tactical advantages. Matsuo pulled a knife, slashing with professional technique. Kenji deflected with his forearm, accepting a minor cut to establish control of the blade hand. His counter came from thousands of hours of close quarters combat training, a precision elbow strike that collapsed Matsuo's trachea, just enough to disable without killing. 2 more Yakuza converged on Takeo, assuming the blind musician was the easier target. Their mistake became apparent when Takeo's baton connected with the first attacker's knee, guided by sound alone. The second found himself falling as Takeo, tracking his footsteps perfectly, swept his legs with practiced precision. "Behind you, 2 o'clock," Takeo called out, his ears detecting what Kenji couldn't see while engaged with another attacker. Kenji responded instantly, dropping beneath the strike coming from that exact direction. The partnership that had begun as protector and protected had evolved into something far more effective. 2 specialists, covering each other's vulnerabilities out in less than 30 seconds. All 8 Yakuza lay disabled. Kenji moved to Takeo's side, scanning for additional threats while helping the violinist to his feet. The crowd had backed away but remained watching, phones recording what would undoubtedly become viral footage within hours. Morning light filtered through the police station windows as Takeo Nakamura's fingers moved restlessly across his violin case. Though his sightless eyes stared forward, his heightened hearing mapped the room with precision. 3 officers typing reports, a detective pacing 12 feet away, Kenji's measured breathing beside him, controlled despite the dislocated shoulder. He'd refused treatment for until Takeo was processed. "Nakamura-san," Detective Yamamoto approached, his voice carrying respect that hadn't been present 6 hours earlier. "Your statement has been recorded. No charges will be filed against either of you. Self-defense is clear from multiple witness accounts." Takeo nodded, his fingers finding the exact center of his violin case with practiced precision. "And my instrument?" "Undamaged," Kenji answered before the detective could, his voice betraying no sign of the pain Takeo knew he must be feeling. "I secured it during the initial engagement." On the street outside, journalists gathered despite the early hour. "The Sumiyoshi Kai won't take this public humiliation lightly," Yamamoto warned, lowering his voice. "We're assigning protection." "Unnecessary," Kenji interrupted, his tone respectful but final. The subtle shift in his posture told Takeo everything. His guardian had already planned for this escalation, had contingencies prepared before the first punch was thrown. "Perhaps you don't understand their resources," the detective persisted. "Hikaru Tanaka isn't just any lieutenant. His father sits on the Sumiyoshi Kai Council." Takeo's fingers stilled on his violin case. This detail was new, even to him. The subtle change in Kenji's breathing pattern confirmed his protector hadn't known the full extent of their opponent's connections either. The stakes had just risen significantly. "We understand perfectly," Takeo responded, rising with fluid grace that belied his blindness. His cane remained folded. Here, in a space he'd now mapped mentally, he didn't need it. "But police protection would interfere with my performances." Outside, a black sedan pulled to the curb. Takeo detected its arrival by the sudden change in street noise patterns. 3 men exited, their footsteps revealing military precision that matched Kenji's. The subtle relaxation in his guardian's breathing told Takeo these were allies, not threats. "Your former unit," Takeo stated, not asked. After 4 years together, he'd learned to read Kenji's responses through micro-changes in breathing, stance, and body temperature. "Some debts transcend discharge papers," Kenji confirmed quietly. Detective Yamamoto looked between them, realization dawning. "You anticipated this level of response." "We prepared for multiple contingencies," Kenji corrected. His hand gently touched Takeo's elbow, their signal for imminent movement. The Sumiyoshi Kai miscalculated twice. First in assuming a blind musician was vulnerable. Second in assuming my response would be standard security protocol. As they moved toward the exit, Takeo's acute hearing picked up the whispered conversations of officers watching them pass. Their tone had changed, the initial pity for the handicapped victim replaced with something closer to respect. Perhaps even awe. "Your playing reached more people today than ever before," Kenji observed as they approached the door. "Sometimes, Takeo, art needs protection to flourish." Takeo's fingers tightened slightly on his violin case. And sometimes protection becomes its own kind of art. The streets of Tokyo were silent, except for the distant echo of Takeo's violin, the kind of silence that felt heavy with anticipation. Kenji stood beside him, his body coiled like a steel spring ready to release. The Yakuza's final move was coming. They both knew it. The air was thick with the scent of impending conflict. Takeo's fingers rested lightly on his violin bow, his unseeing eyes turned toward the sound of approaching footsteps, the soft click of expensive shoes against the pavement. "Something's different," Kenji murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper. Takeo nodded his head slightly, a subtle movement of someone who had learned to read the world through sound, the vibrations, the air, the smallest changes in atmosphere. The Yakuza weren't just sending street thugs this time. This was something else. This was personal. This was a statement. The first figure emerged from the shadows. Takeshi Yamamoto, the local Yakuza lieutenant, a man whose reputation for brutality was whispered about in dark corners of Tokyo. His tailored suit pressed perfectly, his movements calculated, each step deliberate. Behind him, two more figures moved with military precision, not street fighters. These were professionals. Trained killers, the kind of men who disappeared people without a second thought. Takeo's fingers tightened on his violin bow, a subtle signal to Kenji. Their communication was beyond words, beyond sight, a language they had developed through weeks of survival, through countless confrontations. The street around them transformed into a battlefield, not with guns or knives, but with something far more dangerous: intention, resolve, the pure will to survive. "You've become quite the problem," Yamamoto spoke, his voice calm but laden with threat, cutting through the early morning stillness. "We've been patient. We've given you opportunities to understand how things work in this city. But some people never learn, do they?" His hand moved slightly, a signal to the men behind him. Takeo remained motionless, his violin still clutched, his head slightly tilted, listening. Kenji's stance shifted imperceptibly, a coiled spring of potential energy. "The local businesses that refused our protection, the street performers who thought they could resist, the street musicians who believed they had rights." Yamamoto's voice grew colder with each sentence. These were more than just words. This was a declaration of war. He looked directly at Takeo. "You think you're something special, a blind musician who thinks he can challenge us." Takeo's fingers moved almost imperceptibly across his violin. Bow, a silent communication with Kenji, a message that needed no words, no explanation, just pure understanding. The street around them seemed to hold its breath. The early morning light just beginning to break. The moment suspended between silence and violence. The final movement was about to begin. The morning light filtered through Tokyo's narrow streets, catching the glint of Takeo's violin strings. The sounds of the city hummed around him, a symphony of movement and life, markedly different from the chaos of weeks past. Kenji stood nearby, not hiding, not hovering, but present, a guardian whose presence spoke volumes without a single word. Asterisk, the street that had once been a battleground now felt transformed. Weeks of confrontation had changed everything. The local businesses that had once cowered now stood tall, windows open, shopkeepers nodding respectfully as Takeo began to play. His music was no longer just a performance, but a statement of resilience, a declaration that art could survive even the darkest of challenges. His fingers moved across the violin, creating melodies that seemed to weave through the very fabric of the street. The music told a story of survival, of hope, of unexpected victory. Each note carried a depth that transcended sound, becoming a language of its own. Asterisk. The Yakuza's grip had been broken, not through violence alone, but through something far more powerful: community resistance. Local shop owners who had once paid protection money now stood united. Police who had previously looked away now actively patrolled the area. Kenji's military connections had helped expose deeper corruption. revealing networks that stretched far beyond this single street. But it was Takeo's music that had truly changed everything. His melodies carried a resonance that stopped passers-by, drawing them not just by sound but by the story they told. The story of a blind musician who refused to be silenced, who turned his disability into his greatest strength. People listened, truly listened, perhaps for the first time. Kenji watched carefully, old habits dying hard. Yet there was something different in his posture now, less tension, more pride. A young girl stopped, her mother pulling her closer. But the child's eyes remained wide with wonder as Takeo played. The violin sang stories without words, a living testament to their journey. The street remembered the battles fought here. Whispers of past confrontations lingered in the air, but they were changing, becoming stories of hope rather than fear. The local shopkeepers had started a protection fund, a community initiative inspired by their unlikely heroes. Takeo and Kenji had become more than just defenders. They were now symbols of resistance, guardians of something precious and unbreakable. The morning stretched on. The music continued, a living, breathing testament to their journey. The street that had once known only fear now knew something else. Hope, resilience, the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to be broken by darkness. Takeo's violin sang, and the city listened, truly listened, perhaps for the first time. Chapter 11. Requiem. Violin trembled in Takeo's hands. The music, a defiant cry against the silence that threatened to consume everything around him. Kenji stood nearby, invisible yet omnipresent, the air thick with the aftermath of their recent confrontation with the Yakuza. The street that had been his stage for years now felt like a battlefield scarred by violence, yet still resonating. With hope, Takeo's fingers moved across the strings, creating a melody that spoke of resistance, of survival, of something far more powerful than the threats that had surrounded him. The sounds of Tokyo swirled around him, traffic horns, distant conversations, the subtle movements of people passing by. Each sound was a map, each vibration a story he could read better than most could see. Kenji's breathing remained a constant rhythm, a counterpoint to his music. The brief moments of silence between notes told as much of their story as the music itself. They had survived something that would have broken lesser partnerships, lesser people. Memories flickered like shadow street performers who had been forced out, beaten down, intimidated now, watching from the edges of his performance. Their hope rekindled by his stubborn refusal to be silenced. The Yakuza had miscalculated. They thought fear would drive him away, but music was his weapon, his shield, his voice. Kenji had taught him that protection wasn't just about physical defense. It was about maintaining your spirit, your purpose, your art. The melody shifted darker, more intense, reflecting the tension of their recent battles. The music spoke of struggle, of pain, of ultimate triumph. The local shopkeepers who had once cowered now stood a little straighter, watched a little closer. Their silent support was a wall of human protection around Takeo and Kenji, something the Yakuza hadn't anticipated. The power of a community awakened. The Yakuza's response was calculated, deliberate, a show of force meant to crush their spirit. But Takeo and Kenji had become something more than just a musician and his protector. They were a system, a living, breathing mechanism of resistance. The attack came just after sunset, when the streetlights cast long shadows and the city seemed to hold its breath. Kenji's movement was lightning precise, calculated. Each motion was a mathematical equation of survival. Takeo's violin remained strapped to his back, his hands free, his other senses heightened, scanning the environment, listening, feeling the vibrations of approaching danger. The first attackers didn't even make a sound, but Takeo heard them. The subtle shift of fabric, the barely perceptible movement of air before bodies could strike. This wasn't just protection. This was a dance, a perfect synchronization of skills that defied conventional understanding. Takeo wasn't just a blind musician, he was a tactical asset. His heightened senses created a map of the environment that Kenji could transform into a defensive strategy. The Yakuza had brought more men this time, believing overwhelming force would break their resistance. But they had no concept of the bond they were challenging. The first attacker moved silently, but Takeo's hand was already moving, signaling Kenji before the movement could complete, a whispered warning that translated into instant action. Kenji's body became a shield, a weapon, a living barrier. The street transformed into a battlefield, but not the kind of battlefield anyone expected. This was a performance of survival, of resistance, of two souls so perfectly synchronized that they moved as one. Local witnesses would later describe it like a dance, like a performance more than a fight. Kenji's martial arts blended with Takeo's musical precision, creating something that defied description, something that spoke to a deeper truth about human connection, about the power of unexpected partnerships, about the strength that emerges when vulnerability meets protection. By the time the last attacker fell, the street was quiet again. Takeo's violin case remained untouched, his instrument unharmed. The message was clear. They would not be silenced. They would not be moved. This was their stage, their city, their life, and no amount of violence could change that.